Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Joe McVey, and I'm the Chief Executive of Brain Injury Matters. While we're waiting for people to join us and to sign in today, I just wanted to draw your attention very quickly to our guidelines for this afternoon, which you can see in front of you. Just to highlight the fact that the discussion is being recorded. As attendees, you won't have access to your camera or microphone. We're very keen that people will interact with us with questions and answers as much as possible and get through them as quickly as we can. And obviously, if you have any technical details, there's the email address to connect with. So those are our housekeeping addresses and guidelines. And I just want now to formally pass over to get the afternoon started to our Chairman of Brain Injury Matters, Mr. Gough. Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you, Joe, and good afternoon and welcome to everyone who's joining our panel discussion this afternoon. You're all very, very welcome. I suppose really just to kick off, why are we hosting this? And I suppose the answer is coming out of the pandemic, we in Brain Injury Matters have been engaged in a process of looking forward, looking to the future, trying to reflect on what we have learned as a Northern Ireland-wide brain injury charity and how we might respond. And this has led to a process of us looking at our internal vision for the next 4 years up to 2025. What type of an organisation do we wish to be? What services do we need to be delivering? And what might the future of services look like? And as part of this debate, we wanted to explore with others the key issues as we see them related to acquired brain injury in Northern Ireland. For example, is there sufficient understanding of acquired brain injury, its causes, effects, and consequences for individuals, their families, and wider society? As someone, I suppose, who has first-hand knowledge of acquired brain injury in the family, I see the complexities and the problems that can bring and misunderstandings. How do we increase the level of understanding of acquired brain injury amongst the general public, within government, statutory services, across education, health, justice, criminal justice system, within our prisons? You know, for example, I think a couple of years ago, we did some research with Queen's University Belfast into the number of young offenders that had an acquired brain injury. Is there a need for greater statutory government support for those living with acquired brain injury? Can we do more to reduce the incidence or consequences of acquired brain injury through education awareness, campaigns, legislation? And how do we best support those living with acquired brain injury, including their families and carers? And how are the support needs of those living with acquired brain injury likely to change over the next 5 years? Those are some of the questions, some of the areas we've been trying to explore with others and indeed this evening. And one way of Brain Injury Matters, one way of us doing this is the engagement that we've undertaken over the past 12 months, the discussions we've been having and continue to have with colleagues in the statutory sector, voluntary sector, with our participants, our clients, families and friends, to try to assist us to understand the landscape and offer appropriate and effective service over the next 5 to 10 years. So with that context and with that introduction, I'm pleased to welcome our panel this evening. As Chairman of Brain Injury Matters, I'm delighted that we're going to be able to share a debate this evening, conversation, and I'm sure we'll get a range of views and insights. So I'm absolutely delighted to have our Health Minister, Chair and members of our Health Committee with us this evening. So look, without further ado, I'd like to hand over and like to welcome our Minister for Health, Mr. Swann, MLA.
And thanks, Gordon, and good evening, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here at today's event. And firstly, I want to thank Joe for inviting me to deliver this opening address at the Brain Injuries Matters AGM, which will include this discussion on acquired brain injury. and that's to explore the key developments, the challenges and opportunities for those working in the field of acquired brain injury in Northern Ireland over the next 5 years. Earlier this year in May, I was pleased to give the opening address at Brain Injury Matters Conference on childhood brain injury. So I'm delighted to be here again, albeit in a virtual capacity. Your important discussions today, I think, will provide you with a valuable opportunity to consider the future provision of services for those affected by an acquired brain injury. And indeed, my department has been considering such service provision going forward as part of the ongoing review of our neurology services across Northern Ireland. I will talk a bit about that later on, because all of us here today are I'm sure, well aware that an acquired brain injury can be complex and its effects can fluctuate for each person. And the resulting cognitive, emotional and behavioural effects can often be misunderstood, or they may not be immediately recognised. So that can actually result in people failing to get the help they need. So therefore, raising the public awareness is of a particular importance. Each year we have Action for Brain Injury Week in May, which is supported by the Health and Social Care Board and our Public Health Agency. And as you'll be aware, its focus is to raise awareness of the impact of living with brain injury, and of course to highlight the various support services that are available throughout Northern Ireland. In Action for Brain Injury Week, it's made possible through a collective partnership approach by brain injury charities in Northern Ireland, who arrange various events and activities during the awareness raising week. And as the Health and Social Care Board actually hosts a bespoke suite of information and lecture on its website to help raise awareness of brain injury. And a recent campaign for promoting awareness of mild brain injury, which was called Know the Risks, actually helped to further help in recognising and responding to concussion. That credit card sized information aids have also been distributed to all hospital emergency departments and a range of our community locations, and that includes GP surgeries, libraries and schools. Our brain injury specialist service providers, such as our health and social care trusts, community brain injury teams, the Cedar Foundation, Headway, and the Child Brain Injury Trust, provide free brain injury awareness training to promote awareness of the impact of brain injury and how to provide that all-important support in a range of environments. But in addition to Action for Brain Injury Week, organisations, as I said, such as Headway, Cedar and the Child Brain Injury Trust campaign, they campaign all year round to reduce the incidence of brain injury, but also to increase the awareness of its effects. Headway's Concussion Aware campaign, I believe, is also a good example of how the charity is changing the public's perception of what we might call, I think, what we might call a minor knock to the head, and its potential implications, and that's whether sustained through sport or elsewhere. So by using sport to highlight the issue, I think has enabled the charity to increase the public's understanding of the short and long-term implication of head injuries. And that's with a greater recognition that all head injuries can be serious, and even a relatively minor head injury can have significant implications. So the development of major trauma centres such as the Royal Victoria Hospital has helped as well to drive the standard of acute care for acquired brain injury. There still remains further scope for development with regard to access to post-acute and specialist community-based neurology rehabilitation and support. The access to specialist neurological rehabilitation can make a significant difference to an individual's long-term prognosis. So it's at the Regional Acquired Brain Injury Unit at Musgrave Park Hospital, which does that excellent work in that area. So it's important that patients have access to local or regional specialist brain injury rehabilitation with support from neurophysiologists, neurophysiotherapists, speech and language therapists, and occupational therapists, actually regardless of where they live. So that's why the specialist community-based rehabilitation and support services that are contracted to the Health and Social Care Board, again, such as those provided by Cedar, Headway and the Child Brain Injury Trust are actually crucial in helping brain injury survivors to rebuild their lives and regain as much of their independence as possible. As we know, brain injury can affect every aspect of a person's life. Therefore, I believe that all government departments and agencies need an awareness and an understanding of this impact. And that includes housing, education, welfare, and justice. So widening this issue further than health and social care would help to ensure that all are integrated and all have an integrated pathway of care. Because I believe there's also scope via social media campaigns, and again, working with schools or universities, or employers, the PSNI, and others to actually promote a prevention message. Because we know that road traffic accidents, assaults, workplace accidents and falls in older people are common causes of acquired brain injury. And it's our community and voluntary services and ABI teams who already play a role in disseminating prevention messages and actually how to seek support after suffering a brain injury. Our GPs and our hospital emergency departments also have a very important role to play, both in prevention and post-brain injury interventions. So Headway is working actually on a UK-wide basis with the National Farmers Union on a safety and awareness campaign which specifically targets farmers. The aim there is to reduce the number of traumatic brain injuries actually that result from quad bike or equipment-related accidents. And that's while ensuring carers and remote communities know that help is available. The Cedar Foundation services actually have over 500 placements to provide ABI specialist services for children and adults with brain injury. And it's their person-centered, flexible support that builds the capacity of the individual for long-term positive outcomes. Because our carers play an invaluable role in helping brain injury survivors live as independently as possible. And too often carers are not aware of the supports that are available to them. So the needs of carers must be recognised as well. And through its contract with the Health and Social Care Board, again, Headway provides support to carers and families of people with a brain injury. So the next steps in the introduction of our integrated care partnerships will also provide an opportunity to bring together acute and non-acute health and social care providers. And that will ensure people do not slip through the net. Because our people with disabilities and the most vulnerable in our society have been amongst those most severely affected by the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. It's those longer term impacts that will be significant for people with brain injury, as it's their previous activities, their previous employment, their previous volunteering opportunities and their previous routines will have been disrupted. Because brain injury is a lifelong condition with usually and hopefully a full life expectancy. The significant investment of resources at the acute phase and discharge to community brain injury teams for the continuation of rehabilitation in the homes is well established. But to protect the progress that has been made and actually build forward in the longer term, the access to family supports, vocational rehabilitation and inclusion services are critical to support the health and well-being of the individual with a brain injury and their family. I believe these are being successfully provided by key community and voluntary partnerships using a co-production approach that is aligned to the community services adult care pathway. So it's recognising the importance of those commission services and community partnerships that will be a key factor in actually supporting the needs of those living with ABI in the next 5 years with a more secure funding commitment beyond those 1 year short-term contracts. So I'd like to conclude my contribution this evening, opening address, by talking about my plans for the future of neurology services in Northern Ireland. Because my department's ongoing regional review of neurology services actually aims to identify the optimal configuration of what neurology services will be for the next 10 to 15 years. And that will ensure that patients across Northern Ireland receive timely access to neurological assessment, diagnosis, treatment, condition management, and support and rehabilitation. So the interim report that was published back in October 2019 actually set out the case for change with data from an updated population health needs assessment, which was used to illustrate the pressure on their neurology services and an ongoing gap between outpatient referrals and their current capacity. It was that report that also set out a direction of travel for the second and final phase of the review team's work, which has been taken forward through various work streams. And it was in March 2020 that the decision was taken to pause the review in the context of COVID-19 pressures. The neurology review team has reconvened its work in June of this year, and that work will continue because it's important work. And clearly, it's through the completion of the review that will be subject to available clinical capacity in the context of ongoing COVID-19 pressures. Finally, and just in closing, I would like to take this opportunity to wish you all a very successful and informative event panel session. So thank you very much.
Minister, thank you very much for your kind words of support. Much appreciated, and particularly given the pressures you're under yourself. And I want to thank you and the team for your leadership over the past 18 months and continue to guide us through very difficult and very challenging times. And I look forward to your continued support. I also think, if I may say, Robin, has been very helpful for you to provide that overall strategic context in terms of the review of neurology, and also I think to highlight the need for both the strategic clinical support and also the very important role played by the voluntary and community sector organisations. And I know you've always been very committed to the role those organisations, including ourselves, have played. And I think also to highlight the comment you made about acquired brain injury being a lifelong issue and challenge for people. And I think in terms of, I suppose, in terms of Brain Injury Matters, adopting that vision statement of living beyond ABI for us is critical, and seeing people, seeing the person and not simply the diagnosis or the issue that they're living with. So, Minister, thank you. And again, we look forward to continue to engage with you in the short and longer term. I wish you every success with your work, Robin. So thank you again. And
Joe, thank you very much.
Welcome to stay on, but I appreciate maybe one or two other things on your table. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Robin. Thank you. Well, that brings us to the start of our panel discussion. And I just wanted to say that I'm delighted that so many people have joined us this afternoon. We have about 75 people on the call today with a very diverse backgrounds. We have those currently living with acquired brain injury, with parents, with carers. We're also a very diverse group of academics, clinicians, practitioners from health, education, prisons, justice. So it's great to see so many people take an interest in the topic. And we also have a very diverse and interesting panel as well. So I'm looking forward to that. Just to, I suppose, outline the format. I know people are very much used to these type of discussions now. So what we're going to do, I'm going to say a few words with the panel members, and then we're going to ask the panel members to offer their initial comments and thoughts. And once we've had that from each of the panel members, we'll open it up for discussion and for question and answers. And I'll see we've already some questions coming through already, which is absolutely great. So once we've done that, then what we'll do is answer the questions as best we can, but we will guarantee we'll finish as close to 6:30 as possible, because I'm mindful that people have had a long day and have other things to do. So I would also emphasize to say we'll get through as many questions as we can. Before we start, I have to offer an apology, which is never a great way to start. I've just got a message from Chris Bryant. Unfortunately, Chris is dealing with a family issue. I think his father's been taken unwell, so Chris isn't able to join us this afternoon. So he sends his apologies and will no doubt join us at another event in the near future. So my apologies for that. So our panel, I want to say a few words about the panel this afternoon. We have 3 panel members. Our first panel member I want to introduce is Dr. Yuna Mccrudden. Eunan is a very experienced clinical psychologist with many years experience in the field of brain injury, both through his clinical training, but also in his current practice and his role as clinical lead within the Belfast Health and Social Care Community Brain Injury Rehabilitation Team, and also in his role as lead within the MoMA project. And Eunan also continues to have a role as a clinical supervisor in paediatric neuropsychology. So Eunan, you're very welcome and thank you for joining us. Our second panel member is Bridget Smith, and Bridget is known to all of us in Brain Injury Matters very well. She's the head of our Children and Young People Services. Bridget is a very experienced clinical practitioner, as a social worker and a systemic family practitioner in working with children, adults and young people in a range of settings, both in the voluntary and statutory sector. In her current role as head of Brain Injury Services, Bridget leads a multidisciplinary team, and I think it's been instrumental in the development and growth and scope of our work with children and young people over the past 4 years, and doing that with her team, but also working very closely in partnership with Eunan and with the trusts and with other trusts across Northern Ireland. So I'm delighted that Bridget's with us, and Bridget, you're very welcome. Thank you. And our third panelist is Colin Gilderview Mla. Colin is a MLA representing Fermanagh and South Tyrone, who will be known to quite a few people here this afternoon. Colin actually, I think, perhaps uniquely as a politician, comes from a very varied background, having worked in the private sector, running a very successful engineering business, then moving into social work, and then moving into politics, which is, I think, a very interesting transition. And he's also mad keen on traditional music, which he might get into this afternoon if things go well. But Colm, as everyone will know, is very active in the health and social care front. He is the party spokesman for Sinn Féin on health and social care, and he's also been very active as chair of the Assembly Health Committee. And also, Colm also is actively involved in a range of other health committees within Stormont. So he comes to us with a great experience of health and social care, and also has a particular interest, picking up what the Minister said around the issue of support for families and carers and their role within supporting individuals. So very interesting panel. I'm delighted that everyone has joined us. So just to get the discussion going, I'd ask the panel members if they maybe give us their initial thoughts on the topic of acquired brain injury from their particular perspective and experience. And they're going to take a few minutes to do that, and then we're going to open it up for the panel discussion and question and answers. So I'll go to Eunan first, if I may. Thank you, Eunan.
Thanks, Joe. I suppose just while I was thinking about and getting ready for today's presentation, I kind of took some time to think back about, well, what has been my experiences of acquired brain injury. I've worked obviously within paediatric services in the Royal Belfast Hospital for Sick Children for almost 10 years. And I've also more recently then moved across into adult services and been working as clinical lead within Belfast Trust's brain injury services within the community for the last 3 years or so. But one of the things that then came to light for me was actually one of my earliest experiences of brain injury was actually while I was still at school myself. A young man who was attending the same school as I did had the unfortunate occurrence of a mountain biking accident. He came off his bicycle without a helmet on. And I remember at the time being quite surprised that in the days and weeks after the injury and the accident, that we didn't see him for quite some time. And it was actually months later before he ever actually returned to the community, let alone actually, I can't actually remember him ever actually coming back to our school again. And I suppose that in a nutshell has almost been my experience professionally with brain injury as well. I think I remember the discussions within the community at the time of the injury, at the time that young man was sustained his injuries. And I remember people talking about the changes and the disruption and the impact that had for him personally, but then also for his family. I do remember actually, he wasn't in my class, but I do remember some discussions as well at that time about what the other young people must have been thinking who had been there whenever the accident occurred, but then also who adjusted to his failure or his inability to return to the school of which we had been attending. And I suppose, as I said, that's in a nutshell has been comparable to an awful lot of my experiences that I have seen and have been involved with through my clinical work over the time that I've been in clinical practice. As I've mentioned, throughout the time in children's services and also doing some work into the Royal as well, I have seen the impact and the implications of brain injury at the most acute stages. I've seen families sometimes within days of the injury having been sustained and their child being in ICU, and walked with them on that path as they moved from having a child who in many cases parents were told may never actually survive, and then the parents were advised that, well, no, your child may well survive, but may well survive with very significant difficulties. I've seen the same from the adult side of hospitals. I've seen the same from the adult ICU as well. And I suppose going back to Minister Swann's kind of observations, I suppose the reality is that the difficulties that the young people, children, adults, and their carers or family members actually experience do impact on multiple areas of their lives. There are substantial numbers of people who sustain brain injuries and actually have very, very good recoveries, and that is to be lauded and that is to be acknowledged and recognized. But for those people who have longer term difficulties, it is an issue that does impact on every area of their function, whether that's in terms of access, whether it's in terms of mobility, whether it's in terms of their care needs, and whether it's in terms of their longer term vocational employment or involvement in services and so on. I suppose one of the things that I've become more aware of and more alive to over the last 3 years or so working within the community brain injury team has been about how brain injuries can have very, very significant impacts on adults' identities as parents and as carers. We recently have begun work looking at how we intervene at a family level to help parents continue to be parents in the context of significant brain injury related difficulties. We've also kind of been dealing as well with the impact and the care needs that people can have in the longer term and how that impacts on things like private nursing homes, and how we can arrange and ensure that packages of care and the staff that provide those packages of care are adequately supported, advised, trained, and aware of the difficulties that these service users may actually present with. And I think that's one of the things that has become a mainstay of my clinical work as well over the last, over the last 12 years certainly, has been the need to ensure that there is a professional understanding, whether we're talking about professionals in education, in healthcare and social care, as to the longer term implications of acquired brain injuries. I think it's only when we ensure that those people who are around the person with the brain injury are fully aware of and able to support those people that will be able to help them live beyond their brain injury, as is the expressed intention of Brain Injury Matters. I suppose the other thing that I repeatedly come up against and kind of work with people in relation to is about how the person with the injury actually sees themselves, how they adjust, how they make sense of what has happened, and how they kind of resolve maybe to move on and live the rest of their lives after their injury without their injury being the thing that actually defines them. So one of the things I suppose is very important to remember here is exactly how do we ensure that persons with the brain injury are able to engage with the types of services that can help them, whether that's through the voluntary sector or whether that's through services that are maybe more orientated around health, mental health, or social care. But as I said, I think that the reality is that when I've been working more recently in adult services, the reality and the long-term and in most cases lifelong implications of especially moderate to severe injuries has become more apparent to me, and it has also become apparent about how that places maybe some strains and causes difficulties in terms of how services meet service users' needs in the longer term. So with that, Joe, I'm happy to hand over.
Lovely. Una, thanks very much for giving us food for thought to start with then. I'm just going to pass over quickly to Bridget, if that's okay. Bridget, over to you. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. And hello and good afternoon, everyone. And Joe, yeah, thank you for the introduction and indeed inviting me to be on the panel today. As Joe said, my name is Bridget Smith. I am the head of the Children and Youth Service in Brain Injury Matters. I suppose within the Children and Youth Service, we work with children and young people 0 to 18 with acquired brain injury and their families across Northern Ireland. The service, it was first established in 2015, and that was in partnership with the Psychological Department of the Belfast Health and Social Care Trust, and is currently funded by the National Lottery Community Fund. I suppose initially the service was designed to work with children 0 to 12 and their families. However, due to the success of the programme in 2020, we were granted additional funding from the National Lottery and indeed Children in Need to continue that service for a further 2 years, and also to extend its reach to children and young people 0 to 18. This funding actually runs out in 2022. But what the service provides is family-focused interventions. It's a whole family approach, working with children, young people, parents, siblings, and extended family. It's very much intensive support with the family for up to a year, working within their environment, online or via telephone. And I suppose, yeah, the service it's bespoke. It's tailored to the family's needs around acquired brain injury, and that could be work, as Eunan was talking about, coming to terms with the changes to the child or young person due to their acquired brain injury. It could be the changes to the family dynamic since the acquired brain injury, issues that have materialised, difficulties in terms of behaviour, perhaps sleep or anxiety. And I suppose we work in a way that is evidence informed. So we draw on research, we draw on best practice in terms of acquired brain injury or trauma, parenting practices, mental health and sensory-based interventions. We try to very much work in a solution-focused way. So it's about problem solving, it's about empowering the family themselves to manage and cope with acquired brain injury, and looking at a systems-based approach where it's linking in with families, school, community, other professionals, indeed the other voluntary sector. And I suppose for me, since I've been part of the Children and Youth Service team, I've seen the service evolve over the last number of years. And in my opinion, I suppose I feel that the success has been in part due to the fact of the way that we work. In terms of the whole family, we work with the whole family. We don't just work with the child in isolation, and that the work in itself is very much bespoke and it's tailored to those individual family needs, and interventions in themselves are designed and adapted to suit the family within their environment. Indeed, I suppose there's, from our approach, it's no one size fits all. And I think the fact that we consider the family and not just the child has aided and definitely empowered families and helped them better understand and manage and address their child and their young person's needs in relation to the ABI. And I think this is also, what we have found, this has also helped the child and the young person better come to terms with the changes in their lives. And I suppose, from our perspective, I think that multidisciplinary nature of the team that we have and the partnership with the Belfast Health and Social Care Trust has been very much instrumental in enabling us as a service to support families in very much a holistic way, and that idea that we pull our differing skills of the professionals to support families. However, that being said, there is clearly continues to be challenges for children and young people and their families. And over the last 4 years, what I've seen is significant issues around the timing of support and accessing services. What we see is referrals to our service are on average 3 to 4 years post-injury. And while this time frame is reducing, it certainly indicates to me both a lack of post-acute support for families and indeed a lack of knowledge of the limited supports that there currently are available for children and young people. And what we're constantly hearing from families that following on from discharge from acute services, they feel pretty much left to their own devices and are left to come to terms with the life-changing conditions that the ABI has presented them, or indeed as the issues begin to materialise for their child, that they're left not knowing who to turn to. And I suppose what we've also found from parents is that there is a clear lack of understanding for them and how to navigate the system, and equally poor access to psychological and mental health support for children and young people, but also their family system. And I remember one parent remarking to me in terms of what she was saying was there appears to be precious little out there to help children living with acquired brain injury, and certainly without the support of Brain Injury Matters, she had felt that her family would have been totally floundering trying to cope with, and this was her words, her new normal. I suppose another thing I would like to add is that just passed in May 2021, Brain Injury Matters with the psychology services of the Belfast Health and Social Care Trust, we hosted a children and young people acquired brain injury that the Minister had talked about, and that was about developing services for children living with acquired brain injury, the good practices and the opportunities and challenges. And certainly, my experience was that the conference highlighted some positive examples of collaborations and projects between health, education and the voluntary sector, and definitely identified some good examples of evidence-based models of working that has supported, not only the child, but the child's family and the wider community networks. For example, what I've talked about in terms of the work in terms of Brain Injury Matters. However, I think it was also very clear from that conference, the voice of, in terms of the voice of families and the feedback that we received, that there continues to remain limited provision and unmet need in the services available, certainly for children and young people with acquired brain injury and their families. I do believe there continues to be issues around awareness. We need to continue to educate those both within health and education to understand the implications of a child or young person's injury, and to understand the longer term implications of this injury in the child and family. And I think we also need more effective intervention. We need to develop a dedicated inpatient rehabilitation service and specialist community services for children and young people with acquired brain injury, where there's more access to services that also support mental health and psychological well-being. There is some good collaboration out there, but we need more of that. We need to ensure a more seamless provision of services across health, education and the voluntary sector. And this could be better. In terms of family, we need to considerate need to give good consideration to the impact on families and carers. Families they need better and easier access to the training and the family focused support that they need. And this support needs to meet their needs, and it needs to be ongoing. I suppose from our perspective, the only service that we see that supports a whole family approach is currently via Brain Injury Matters, and that is actually voluntary funded and comes to an end next year. I suppose ultimately, my concern is that we lack resources. There's a clear need for additional resource to ensure service provision for children and young people living with acquired brain injury. And it needs to be appropriate, it needs to be timely, and the support and there needs to be a seamless model of delivery and support. In terms of my experience, certainly working in Brain Injury Matters, working with families, working on the ground, organising and being part of the conference and even putting together the summary report, I do find it frustrating, that these are not new issues and have been raised time and time again over the last 20 years. And I suppose something that hit me was the words of the late Nigel Williams, who was the Northern Ireland Commissioner for Children and Young People in 2003. And what he said at that time was, yes, there was first-class regional services, first-class regional acute services for children with ABI in the province. But there was a real issue what happens when children are no longer in intensive care, and especially when they return home. And I suppose I do wonder, and my question is, 20 years later, how much has actually changed? So I'll thank you, and I will pass you on.
Bridget, thanks very much. Again, a lot of food for thought and challenging end to that. So I just want to pass over then to Colm, if I may. Colm, either for reflection on what you've heard, Colm, or maybe a bit more about your own role and also the role of the Health Committee as well. So Colm, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Joe, and thank you to everyone who has already contributed. And I'd like to thank Joe and Gordon from Brain Injury Matters for inviting me along to this very important panel discussion on acquired brain injury and, crucially, that concept of building for the future. I'd also like to commend Joe and his team for the ongoing work they're doing to support, promote and empower all of those who are impacted by acquired brain injury. And I think that I'm looking forward today to hearing the interactions from people on the line who are experts by experience, but also even in terms of the contributions we've already heard. I think there's a lot of the concerns have been reflected. A lot of what needs to happen, I guess, is known about, but the concern is that either things aren't happening or that there are huge challenges to surmount in the time ahead. And I guess that's the value of having a session like this, to put some focus on that. In terms of my own experience, I have, as a social worker, worked with people who have had acquired brain injury. And what struck me in many of the cases that I worked with was the traumatic impact that this entire change had brought about on a whole family system. Potentially, a case where someone who had been a very active and a very central part of the family in prior to the brain injury, while still very active and very central, the roles had changed to some degree, and that would often be challenging for people who were then in a position of where a relationship had changed to one where there was an element, perhaps significant elements, of caring for someone. who had previously been maybe your rock or your support within the family, and all of the trauma that went with that, and the challenges that presented in terms of independence, even in terms of income, in terms of the relationships. So I think it's something that has an impact away beyond the individual who has developed or has experienced an acquired brain injury. I do think in many ways there has been a good job done in the sense over the past number of years, from my own observation in relation to the awareness, and I think, and it's been mentioned here by other speakers, I think that is largely sport has maybe led the way, along with groups like brain injuries today. And I certainly became much more aware of the impact and the danger of brain injury as a result of, even within our own local GAA club here, there was a discussion one night around secondary concussions. And I was impressed, I have to say, with the level of awareness there was with club officials at the danger of that situation, something I hadn't been aware of, but they were very aware of. I had attended one of the club committee meetings. So I think there's more awareness now, but I think the outstanding issue remains the supports around all of it. It is good, I think, to hear from Eunan there, a clinical lead who is so clued into the need for social support, and that whole issue around support around cognitive, emotional, behavioural, all of those elements of the support. And I suppose I was also reflecting during the contributions in my previous time as a social worker. I had worked in crisis in the mental health, one of the mental health teams, and the approach they took, it was very grandly titled biopsychosocial approach, but it actually boils down to a very important concept, which was that you would look at the physical and the health needs, but also the social and emotional and support needs of people as well, and that you wouldn't overly medicalize the solutions, and certainly on a longer ongoing basis that you would provide those supports. I also was, I think it's an important point that the Minister made there around the need for cross-departmental awareness and cross-departmental working in relation to this, along with so many other issues that impact health. But it's something clearly that we would need to be working on at the Assembly level and indeed at committee level. I was pleased to hear that there's some consideration as part of the regional review to a dedicated service, because I think that will be something that will be helpful. And also the concept of co-production, I think, is key here, and something that needs to be not only referred to in the abstract, but engaged with in reality, and that families and get a proper say in terms of tailoring that support, because no two cases, and I found this from my social work time, no two cases will be the same. No two sets of solutions will be the same, nor indeed sets of problems at times. One other thing that I would want to flag up as part of today's discussion is around the issue of child carers, young people who themselves are providing care and support. I think we need to do much more to identify and recognise that cohort of carers within education and anywhere else that we interact with children, that we would seek to find out where there's caring role involved with the child and how that child can be supported, or indeed sometimes just understood that there is a caring role. It's sometimes just a basic understanding of the impact of a caring role can have for anyone. And I know that as far as the Health Committee is concerned, this has been a key focus in terms of the role of carers, and particularly unpaid carers. I think COVID has exacerbated and underlined the amount of informal or unpaid care that is done out there on a daily basis. I think we have supported those carers poorly pre-COVID, and I think that has been exacerbated as a result of COVID, and I think it's something that we need to continue to focus on. The other thing, and I suppose coming to a close in terms of my opening remarks, is the issue of workforce, which is the elephant in the room largely in all of these discussions. And I think there's clearly a need across health and social care in every field, a need to retain and recruit additional workforce in order to deliver the services that are badly needed across a range of areas, and this is no different. And one of the ones actually that struck me today was in relation to a recent meeting I did with the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapy, and around some of the solutions that they bring, and some of the solutions that many of the allied health professionals bring to these situations. But we don't have, at times, we don't seem to have a fully joined up approach to it. And then we are also being, even when the approach is there or the approach is recognised, developing the workforce to meet the needs that we are going to be facing in the time ahead here as a society. So I think there's huge discussions to be had there. I welcome today as a part of that. I'm keen to hear from people who have experienced this, what the barriers, what the problems, what the worries are, and I will certainly bring that, you know, as a summary of that back to the Health Committee. And I think this is a Health Committee that would have been very keen to have done a lot of work on a lot of issues which we're touching upon today. And obviously, the pandemic has impacted the ability to do that. But I can assure you that the Health Committee we have currently, and I'm talking right across the Health Committee, are very conscious of the issues that are facing people out there, and are very keen to try to do something in whatever way we can as a committee to impact upon improving the lot of people out there who are struggling with this. I also think there's a value in it for us in terms of shifting left and getting support out into the community and out into families and carers. You then start to see a benefit of that in terms of maybe impact on other services. So in a sense, it's a win-win, but a very difficult nut to crack nonetheless. Sin Misha, Joe, thank you.
Well, many thanks, and we didn't ask you to burst into song or do anything else this evening, but we might do that later on, but much appreciated. And I think, Colm, just to, and I'll be picking up later on, but I think support from yourself and the Health Committee for all of us in this field is really important, and I think it can really both focus our attention and also allow us to see that there are those supporting us and taking the message that we would all have to the Health Committee and to the Health and Social Care Board. So very, very much appreciated. Thank you. So I want to open up then the discussion to the panel members, and I wanted to pick up, there are a few issues that both Eunan and Bridget and Colin raised, but I wanted to pick up some of the questions that are coming in and sort of try and group them as best I can. A couple of questions around I suppose the fundamentals around acquired brain injury in terms of the level of research there is, the level of understanding amongst the general public, and also around the understanding across statutory services. And I suppose it picks up one of the obvious questions. Acquired brain injury, for those of us who are new to it, relatively new, is sometimes a difficult concept to understand, and you're trying to promote it and people say to you, well, what is an acquired brain injury? People seem to understand autism and cancer, but do, I think, struggle a bit with something which appears a bit unusual. And then when you break that down, people say, well, I get that, I understand what you're talking about. So Bridget, I wondered yourself and Eunan and Colm, is there sufficient research available around the fundamentals of numbers, the demographics, the breakdown across the trusts? And secondly, is there an issue around the general understanding of what acquired brain injury is, and what could we as both voluntary sector and statutory and political do more to raise an understanding of the issue? So maybe through those two sort of general questions at you, and then I'll go into the more specific questions that have been answered. So I don't know who'd like to take that first. Eunan, do you want to pick up on a couple of those?
Yeah, well, I suppose at the basic, Colm, do you want to?
No, I'll come in after yourself, Eunan. Just get that with you.
I suppose from the research that we would kind of work off the basis of, we're looking at probably what would be in and around 2,000 people per annum sustaining brain injuries in Northern Ireland. Now that is brain injuries across the spectrum of severities. You know, we normally talk about mild, moderate and severe injuries. Now that's kind of, in some cases, I think that's extrapolating from, you know, UK epidemiological data and maybe EU data as well, to kind of make that as an assumption and as an understanding. So that's the first question. Like, the second question being around, well, do people understand how acquired brain injuries are acquired? I think that's one of the things that, as you said, it's only whenever you sit and go through it in a little bit more detail with different clinicians and different practitioners, I think that's when it starts to come when it starts to be more understandable. As I mentioned, an awful lot of the involvement that I've had over the last number of years has been in terms of developing and delivering training curricula across health, education, justice, and so on. And I do remember, it's only whenever you actually take the time to actually explain exactly that we're not looking just at traumas through road traffic accidents, but we are looking at sporting accidents. We are looking at infections like encephalitis and meningitis. You know, it's only whenever you start talking through all the intricacies of how those are sustained that people start kind of joining the dots and connecting it. I suppose the other thing that kind of comes to mind as well is that it's only when, like, we've developed curricula that are now delivered through the medical school in Queen's. I'm in the process of getting ready to do training with approved social workers, specifically in relation to capacity and brain injury. You know, it's only when there is the time given to developing these resources to allow the professional groups to develop that you can get that understanding. And I think it's actually important that with the understanding and empathy and an ability for the practitioner to actually take the time to understand the person's presentation, the person's experience, that's how you can actually bring about change at that more kind of individual level.
Okay. Thank you very much. Colm, your hand raised, and I'll go to Bridget. Thank you, Colm.
Yeah, I think for me, I have to say that one of the things that I have become increasingly aware of as chair of the committee, and I think again COVID has underlined this, I think we are pretty poor at data, and particularly at data and research, but particularly at bespoke data here in the north. And I think we're probably over-reliant on extrapolating out from other figures. I see one of the comments there has mentioned Encompass, and I think that would be certainly a huge step forward. But I think even now, a lot of data is passing through our hands in health and social care that we could capture more effectively even prior to Encompass. And Encompass is obviously a big thing. And I think in particular, in relation to one of the issues that Bridget raised there around unmet need, I think we're really, really particularly poor at capturing unmet need. And I think the system's under so much pressure that almost in a way, it's the last thing that people want or need to do because it's going to be unmet anyway. But that's fundamentally part of the problem in terms of how we address it. And there used to be, there's a saying in business that what gets, and indeed in health, what gets measured gets done. And the converse is equally true. And that's the difficulty here. What doesn't get measured doesn't get done. And that's what I think we're often saying. So I do think we need to get Encompass into place as quickly as possible. But I think we need to think about how we can do more in the meantime to identify and address need and plan for the future, plan the workforce, plan the services. All of that depends upon data.
I'll mute myself. Colin, thank you very much. I know Bridget loves the phrase unmet need. So Bridget, that phrase, and also the sort of general thing about people's understanding and the level of awareness of acquired brain injury from your perspective, I mean, how good is it, or are we still really, playing catch up with other issues?
Well, I mean, I agree with what's been said here, and I certainly agree with Colm in terms of there is a lack of information, there's a lack of numbers, and that adds to I think that adds then to our lack of knowledge around acquired brain injury, and there does seem to be inconsistencies in terms of even definition and classification, data collection, and at times you wonder if there's inadequate reporting around numbers. And certainly, the figures that I've seen in terms of acquired brain injury, what are available to me, underestimate the situation. And as Colin said, if we don't have that proper information, how do we meet the unmet need? It's vital in terms of planning for coordinated care and the management of our children, and certainly our young people and indeed our adults. And it's also important then in terms of public understanding of the extent of it as well. But I suppose like you had to start whenever you talked about our understanding, and I do feel there is certainly better understanding, and indeed in terms of when people talk about concussion and how sports has kind of improved that as well. But I do still think there's a lot more that we can do. And certainly if you use the word cancer, I mean, to me, everybody knows what that is. They know the impact. They know, regardless of whether it has affected their family or not, but they know how potentially what that impact is going to be on an individual and what the family situation might be like for for that. But when you talk about acquired brain injury, I'm not sure that everybody does. I'm not sure that everybody would understand. And part of that for me is because it's such an umbrella term and it constitutes such a lot as well. And certainly I think when you talk about children and young people in acquired brain injury, I think it's a completely different story when it comes to that than adults. You know, children have strokes, children have brain tumours, children have meningitis, children fall and they're in car accidents, and all those things can result in a brain injury. And I'm not so sure that the wider public would fully understand that. So I do think there's more to be done in terms of our knowledge and understanding of acquired brain injury. And not only just in terms of our public, but certainly in health and in education. And I certainly know in our work, certainly with schools, you know, the schools that we come across, there is a lack of information there. There's a lack of understanding. There's a lack of knowledge around how to support children and young people within the school environment. And I know certainly while it's not within our remit, we have went in and supported schools, you know, in terms of that. So I think there's a lot more work to be done. Yes, you know, there's a good lot of work out there, but there definitely needs to be a lot more in terms of that understanding and the impact and the numbers.
Okay, Bridget, thank you, and Eunan and Colin for that. I mean, and without wanting to labour it, but if we have our baselines and our figures and we have a great understanding, are there practical things we could do now, or the things that are happening what you want to highlight that do raise the general public's understanding? And you mentioned that our work is doing education and training of others. Are there more things that we can do at the moment to raise people's understanding?
I suppose maybe more of a multi-agency joint up approach in terms of that, you know, talking about the PHA, Health and Social Care Board, the NHS, the Educational Authority, the voluntary sector, the police, you know, and coming together to generate better awareness. And you know, if we want the public to understand acquired brain injury, I suppose we need to create better awareness in that, and we need to kind of, I suppose, in terms of going back to that umbrella term, you know, what does it mean and what is the impact?
Okay, you have anything to add to that? Thank you, Bridget.
I suppose, Joe, I'm always quite conscious. I suppose I can think of a couple of cases that I've had involvement with, where I think there's often you know, good news stories. I think the media is very quick to seize upon people who have made miraculous recoveries following on from catastrophic and life-threatening injuries, which is completely appropriate and is completely what we need. We need to have the information about that. But I think what that can do is, I think that can sometimes leave us with a false appreciation of exactly, and I'm not trying to be pessimistic about this, but I'm trying to be realistic about what our experiences are. I think after that honeymoon phase is over, you know, repeatedly I've heard families talk about how, you know, they just can't wait to get out of hospital. They can't wait for their child, their father, their mother, whoever, to walk out of hospital, get home. But the other reality is that it's only whenever they're home that's when the reality starts to appear. That's when people start seeing the difficulties and then starting to think about how they may have to change their own roles as carer and become carers, where they may have been, you know, may have had a completely different identity, completely different approach to life. And, you know, I think there's a balance that we have to strike. And I know I've spoken with Bridget before about this. You know, there is a balance that we have to strike between respecting, obviously, their patient's confidentiality about and their right to a private life. But equally, I think if we only focus on the miraculous recoveries and the fantastic changes that people have seen in the weeks and months immediately post-injury, which is what often does happen, even for the severe injuries that can happen, I think we lose sight of the fact that people can then be living with what is now a chronic lifelong condition. And I don't know, I think it's a difficult one I think that's a difficult piece of information to hand across and to have understood. And as I said, I think it only makes sense when you think about it in terms of real world and people's experiences, but people obviously have the right to their privacy and to the confidentiality, and to not have people knowing their business as well.
I think one of the terminologies that I heard before was silent epidemic, in terms of what it is. And if something is silent, how do we hear it? You know, and I would agree with you, Eunan, in terms of, I mean, the amount of families that we've come across where, you know, they're discharged from hospital and you know, everything's seemingly okay, and then it's only after the return to normal, the return to school, or a few months after that, you know, the impact is actually recognised. So sometimes medically and physically, child appears okay, but it's those cognitive, academic, and psychosocial issues that are materialising. So yeah, it is certainly a very hard thing to kind of, I suppose, you know, how do we help our public? How do we help people understand that, unless you've actually been met with it?
If I can pick up a couple of themes that are coming out from questions, is and it's a perception, or maybe real, in terms of the services and resources make a distinction between adult services and paediatrics. And again, Eunan and Bridget, particularly maybe from your experience, and Colm, maybe seen this, do you feel there is a disparity between the resources and the strategies? And also, again, it's come up in questions around the regional disparity and the sense that services, both for children and adults, appear to be largely Belfast-centric. So there's two issues there: the disparity between adults and children's, and also the sense that people, if they're not living close to Belfast, are really, well, it's a pejorative term, second-class citizens. So interested to get your take on that. Bridget, you may have strong views on that, Bridget, or may have views in terms of.
Well, is there a disparity? For me, yes, I think there is a disparity. Certainly in terms, you know, in terms of children and young people in the community, the care of children with acquired brain injury is dispersed among general community services. However, they may have no specific acquired brain injury skills. As I said before, there is no dedicated or specialist brain injury service for children and young people. There is also, for me, there's a lack of mental health and psychological support for children with acquired brain injury. You know, a regular challenge for us is where children are referred for support without contemporary assessment in terms of their cognition and their adaptive functioning. And you know, this provision of clinical assessment is certainly beyond our remit. And so the absence of that assessment then delays the appropriate supports and provided to children and families. And we know there is the expertise to provide such clinical assessments, and it certainly exists within the regional specialist services. But as you said, not all children are able to avail of those services. And certainly my experience is that such assessments are less available within community paediatric services. And what we hear is families scramble to know, you know, how and where to get support for their children. Certainly, you know, I give example of a case, one particular case we've been involved in, 2.5 years post-injury, and this child has not had the appropriate assessment of their need. And, you know, in my opinion, this has been due to the lack of expertise of the professionals in the area to carry out those assessments. But where that expertise has actually been identified, this child does not live within that area. So, you know, and this is not to take away, you know, certainly this is not to take away from the fact that there are a number of professionals involved in that particular case and are working very hard to support that child and family, but it continues to be a struggle, and it continues to equally be a massive burden on the family. You know, and what we've also seen is, you know, where children or young people are in hospital, there is access to psychological services. However, you know, dependent on your area, this is greatly reduced post-discharge. Again, there's also great limitations to support via mental health services. And, you know, for me, this is despite the fact that research shows that children and young people who have acquired brain injury have higher rates of depression and mood disorders. And, you know, usually what we hear is that young people are not accepted to these services because of the result of their acquired brain injury. And I suppose, I mean, I could go on and maybe I'm on my pulpit here, but there's also, for me, a lack of support, especially for children where they have behavioural difficulties or challenging behaviour and are declined from certain services because they don't make the criteria. And, you know, one of the quotes that we had is they are declined from the service because they require a specialist service in relation to understanding their ABI and managing those behaviours. So at times it seems like there's no one wishing to take responsibility to support this. And again, you know, that's not to take away from the good work that is out there, but I do think there certainly is some disparity, or certainly there's a lack of services in terms of children and young people. And I don't know if Eunan will agree with that, but that's certainly my experience in terms of you know, from the voluntary sector and the families and the children that we work with.
Thank you, Bridget. I would like to see you, Bridget, when you're not passionate about something. So I'll pass it on. I know Colm had his hand raised, and I'll go to Eunan. Thanks very much, Bridget. Thank you, Colm.
Yeah. So yeah, and I think Bridget makes an important point there that we will almost by necessity be focusing on the negatives, but we are taking it for granted that there is some fantastic work, and everyone who goes to work in these services goes out every day to do the best they can. But panels like this do tend to focus on progress, so therefore, by necessity, you're almost looking at what could be better. So I suppose that goes without saying. I think there is an issue around investment and services, particularly west of the Ban. Traditionally, there has been underinvestment, and there's just, I suppose, more barriers in terms of distance, in terms of roads, in terms of broadband. There's a huge range of other barriers out there for population the further maybe west of the Ban you go. So, and that's something that I think we need to look at. There's also the other issue around almost a sense of putting all your eggs in one basket, and I think this was exposed at the, say for example, with the neurological inquiries, where the Belfast Trust have been doing all that, and when that recall came, all the pressure then went on to the Belfast Trust, and it was all, so there's almost I think a way of looking at things here whereby you can kind of build a system across a wider area that works for people and doesn't put all the pressure into one particular pinch point. There's also, I think, within acquired brain injury, in common with other services, a cliff edge in moving from children to adults, and where people almost have to start all over again in terms of the services that they're eligible for, and how they can get those assessments that Bridget has mentioned done. And I have found in recent times, the issue of navigating and negotiating your way through services is hugely problematic for people. And it's also hugely problematic for the health service in that they are constantly having to go over everyone's story and the background to it all, and people become exhausted with trying to go over that. So, and I've raised this with Trust in the past, and it's been raised in the committee around the concept of, where possible, providing a single point of contact. So someone who develops a kind of an understanding of the case, of the needs and all of that, and who can maybe help to navigate people through the system, because people are very seldom doing this in isolation. They're also perhaps caring for other children, caring for older parents, caring for their own health and trying to negotiate all that. And it becomes a huge source of frustration, and it wears people down, actually trying to work their way through the system. And I don't think it does the system any favours either. Again, I think Encompass could play a role, but again, I think that there's other things we could do better prior to Encompass that could help to support people in how they navigate and negotiate their way through services. Thank you.
Colm, thanks very much. I did think you'd feel passionate about that as well. Thank you. That I mean, again, you've seen it from both sides. I've been interested in your take on the question around disparity in terms of services and resources regionally. And it's not to pit one against the other, just from your perspective.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, Joe. This isn't about, saying one service is great and one service is awful. That's not the case at all. Both have kind of their merits. I suppose one of the things that I'm always struck by is whenever I look, now working mainly in adult services, in some ways I look with envy at some of the structures that are in place within children's services, partly because within children's services, there is a clearer wraparound for the child, because there is a statutory right to education that does place responsibility on agencies and services within the state to actually accommodate and make allowances for young people who maybe have brain injuries. Now, there's a whole separate debate about how well that is done, but there is a legal responsibility there that doesn't exist, obviously, in adult services because adults are adults. Now, that then is obviously why we do have each trust area has its own community brain injury rehabilitation team. They are multidisciplinary teams, and they are very much focused on returning people to a level of function. But even then, there are issues there in terms of capacity. We do not, I would say that the service is no service is kind of fully orientated around the fact that, there will be the need for people to come in and out of services at different intervals throughout their adulthood as well. I think there are issues there. From our perspective, we remain and are quite focused on what we would refer to as kind of early goal-directed rehabilitation. And that's by necessity, because we've got a limited resource available to us and a limited staffing capacity available to us. But what we also know is that, things like evolving insight into brain injury can take 2 to 4 years post-injury before it fully resolves to the point where a person is maybe fully connected with the realities of what their life will be like. But unfortunately, then they are often moved on through our service and have not maybe been, there may be issues about them being able to come back in again. And I think that's probably similar across the region's brain injury rehab teams. It's simply that we are not sufficiently staffed to allow for that to be, for people to come in and out as they need to. Now, obviously, that's where there's partnership arrangements in place with people like Brain Injury Matters. That's where there are kind of developments in relation to how the voluntary sector take on some of those responsibilities. But, as I said, I think, are there disparities? Yes. But equally, are there differences in service provision? Most definitely, which are part of the reason why there is a disparity.
And thank you. I mean, one of the issues raised by panel members so far and around the questions is around cross-departmental working and the issue of recognition across the statutory service around ABI. One of the areas that's come up in the questions is the evidence of acquired brain injury within the justice system and how that plays out. And it's come up in a couple of questions and some of the responses. So again, I just wondered from your own perspective, is that an issue that you have come across or you're aware of, or feel that it hasn't been given sufficient spotlight by the Department of Justice, for example?
I don't know that I could. I'm not going to comment on, and I can't comment on what the Department of Justice have done. I'm not fully aware of it. I can't say that. All I can say is that I do remember discussing the issue of brain injury with nurses who worked in forensic settings, and we were talking to them about a screening assessment that was being used. I believe it was called the Chat, and we were asking them about what's the use of this screening tool like, and they said it's no good. And I said, why is it no good? And they said, because everybody's screening positive for having a brain injury. And I said, well, that doesn't mean that it's not good. It just means you've got a significant issue in terms of that service population. But that's what we know from the international literature. That's what we know from the UK-based literature. We also know, though, that putting in targeted, appropriate supports, especially to young offenders who have got a history of a brain injury, those types of supports actually do result in lower recidivism rates. So we know that there are, if the support is targeted and taking into account maybe some of the cognitive or impulse regulation difficulties that these people might actually have, and actually explicitly assisting them and providing them with the support that they need to make better decisions when they leave prison, those can actually have very, very good outcomes. So I think those are things that have been trialed in certain areas. There are pilot projects that have looked at that. And I think that there is evidence to say that that can actually be a very, very useful intervention.
Okay, thanks. Eunan, Bridget, is that something yourself or Colin might want to comment on or have been aware of in terms of young people or women in terms of the justice system and within the prison system?
I suppose in terms of children and young people, obviously very aware of that and very aware of some of the figures that are going about. And certainly, as Eunan has said, I mean, it's not something that I feel expert to talk about, to be quite honest, but I do know, and I have been on conferences and, I have read some of the literature that there are other, in different areas, in different countries, there are other pilot studies and projects that are looking at ways to kind of deal with and in terms of the prison service, in terms of our youth offenders and that kind of thing, in terms of acquired brain injury. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to look at what's happening elsewhere, and we do need to get a better handle on it in this country. I don't have the numbers, and I don't, as I said, I don't have the expertise to talk about it here. So, but I think it is something we do need to look at. It's a very systemic issue. There's no doubt about that. It's not just brain injury when we're looking at young people who offend. So it's a very complex situation, but acquired brain injury certainly is part of that.
Thanks, Bridget. Colin, might want to comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, small point on that, and I think it is an area that actually would benefit from specific focus. And one of the things I found out from recent meetings with the speech and language therapy was around how many they had done. I think this information was collected maybe across the water, but there was research done into the amount of people within the justice system who had speech and language difficulties. And the figures were absolutely shocking. They were within the female adult population, within the female population, 75% of those had issues when assessed, and 100% of the male population. And that any time that 100% comes up as a figure. Now, that underlines the need to have other specialisms and professionals involved in the conversations. And the difficulty is, I suppose, when you're doing commissioning, when you're sitting and looking at who all needs to be in the room, you don't know what it is you don't know unless you have a range of views and perspectives, including families, by the way, as well as professionals. But I think that's just one area that highlights how much more support we could, and targeted and relevant support could be levered in by taking that wider view of what might be needed other than just the basics. And the solutions are out there if we can tap into them. But there's still challenges outstanding, as Eunan has said, around capacity.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Colm. And one of the issues coming out from the discussion and the questions is that focus obviously on the individual, but also around the needs of families and carers, whether it's parents who are trying to support a child, or a husband or wife trying to support a partner who's an acquired brain injury. I just wonder from your perspectives, taking that, Bridget used the term systemic, that whole family approach, are there things we could do more, or interventions or support that would allow us to do that? And it also goes to one of Eunan's first points, that whole issue around identity, and that once you have that acquired brain injury, your relationship to your family member changes and vice versa. So I just wonder, are there more? Could we be doing that? And it's maybe that sense of trying to get an idea of the patient or family journey from diagnosis through to survival. So be keen to get your take on that.
Do you want me to take
Please,
that?
Colin, yeah, please do.
I suppose for me, it's an awful lot of that is about supporting the family who are supporting the individual, and doing that in a timely way and getting that support in before you have arrived at crisis point. I think we're severely lacking in capacity across the system, and again, COVID has driven a coach and horses through that, but these problems pre-existed before COVID. So we need to be honest about that as well and say, listen, we need to be clear, we weren't doing this properly anyway. So what I had found from my experience was the support system very often wasn't kicking in until it had reached almost the point of crisis. Carers were burned out, they were at the end of their tether, and you had drawn fully upon their resilience and goodwill and their own capacity to cope, to the point that you were creating problems. So I think we need to move in sooner where we can, recognizing that if we don't, you're going to have to move in anyway, and probably with a lot more needs at that point in time. I think we need to recognize that carers themselves need to be able to have a life outside of their caring role, and to recognize that their needs for themselves to look after their own health and well-being emotionally and physically are important. And not only parents caring for children, but also children caring for parents, or children caring for siblings. So I think and we have to be honest, we are in a crisis here in terms of social care, and there's a whole debate going on around the need for adult social care, but also children's social care, and we have a staffing crisis in that. But I think as a society, we need to discuss how we would like to be cared for if we were in that position. And I think we need to get a very, very clear understanding that we are going to see more and more support needs out there in the community. If we're trying to move things out of hospital situations into community, then we need to have the infrastructure. And too often we're looking at that, I think, as a cost, purely a cost in recruiting health and social care staff, where there's a social benefit to that, there's a health benefit to it, but there's also an economic benefit, because those people who are employed in those roles to provide that support are spending within the economy. And I think Wales and other places do this better, where they look at those types of recruitment policies as not just a cost, but also as part of your economy. And I think until we have that discussion and we start to measure what it is we need now, what we're going to need in the future, and start to plan about how we put those resources into place, we're going to continue to struggle.
Right, Colin, thanks very much. Bridget, can I maybe go to you next on that issue of additional support for family and carers? I mean, you see it from both sides.
I certainly think, certainly when it comes to children and young people, families, parents, carers need to be included in every stage. I mean, they have a pivotal role in managing their child's recovery and that understanding. And I think that they need long-term support. They need information, and that's not only just on, you know, leaving hospital. I think that needs to be ongoing, and need better understanding of their child's injury and the longer term expectations. Access to that support when it is required. And I suppose, you know, when the difficulties may arise, that they have that easy access, not only for their child, but also for themselves and indeed siblings and extended family, because it just doesn't impact, and as Colin said, it just doesn't impact the mum or dad or the carer. You know, it does impact the whole family dynamic. And I think we need to get better at understanding that and supporting our families and our carers, and especially you know, siblings, where Colm pointed out about young carers, because a lot of the time what we find in terms of working with parents and families is those children themselves then have difficulties because of what's happened within the family environment. And I suppose the need to kind of look after and support the child with their brain injury. And certainly part of our work is to support those siblings, but we do need to get better at it, and we need to do more.
Okay, Bridget, thank you. Eunan, I thought one of your first points around identity and family, I thought was very interesting. I just wondered maybe you just say a few more words about that, and also how we do more to support families and carers.
I suppose, Joe, one of the things when I was preparing for this, one of the things that kind of came to me was actually as I was sitting doing my reading, the helicopter emergency service flew over my head and landed in the Royal. Now, I suppose my experience and my thinking is that there has been obviously very, very great strides forward in terms of acute care. There have been significant improvements in terms of intensive care. We've got a major trauma network right now, which is improving surgical and medical outcomes for patients who have sustained significant and traumatic injuries. To my mind, there hasn't been that, while fantastic, does create a pressure then in community services where people are now surviving who wouldn't have survived 5 or 10 years ago, but also people are surviving now with more complex needs. And there's also something here about people coming into our services with more complex needs before their brain injuries, sustaining their brain injury as a result of substance abuse, drug overdoses, and so on, and then coming out of hospital with very significant needs. I'm not sure that there is the same recognition of the need for an investment to kind of parallel what goes into acute coming into community as well, to allow us to make sure that what we're doing is appropriate, is timely, and is actually what the service users need at that particular point in time. So I think while obviously the investments that have come about in acute hospital settings and post-acute settings is fantastic, I do think there needs to be some consideration given to what is actually happening in community then, with the demands that those investments create and place on outside services but still within the health sector.
Thanks very much, Eunan. I'm conscious of our time, and I have a lot of questions that some of them have been answered, and a lot of very interesting points in the chat function. But in the 5 minutes we have remaining, I just wanted maybe just to put a wee bit of a challenge to the panel members at this time of the day, because we were looking to try and get a sense of what the understanding was of services, what type of services we have. I'm just wondering if we were sitting here in 10 years' time, all looking the same and sprightly and useful, how do you feel that the services or the landscape from acquired brain injury would have changed over the 10 years, or perhaps more importantly, how would you like to have changed? Anybody can go first on that one. Sorry, just keep you on your toes.
So I'll take a.
Thank you, Colin.
What I would like to see is, and I think, you know, we're sitting at a crossroads now of a number of health crises, and every crisis is in itself also an opportunity. And I think that's the way we need to address the situation we're in. I think we need to look at certainly transforming the health system and getting a model of community care out into communities, and preventative care in that sense. I would be very disappointed that the rollout, for example, of the multidisciplinary teams out to GPs has kind of stalled, because I think there are people, physio, mental health workers, social workers who could be working alongside GPs out in communities, and where people could access a lot of their community and social care needs in a way that's very close to them, very accessible, that people within the provision of services have an understanding of the family's needs across a range of issues, and not just within the one silo of expertise maybe that they have. I think our health and social care professionals are up for that challenge, are demonstrating that as it is, and I think we need to build the systems going forward that kind of support that type of more person-centered, family-centered, system-centered, medicalised, certainly where that's needed, but also that the social and the rehabilitation, all of those elements are seen as just as important to getting people back to operating as best as they can with whatever the challenges that have been put in their way, that the entire system's working towards that aim.
Thanks very much, Colm. Bridget, do you want to? Sorry.
I was just going to say that I think there's an important point there in what Colm has just raised, and I think, maybe we're being aspirational about this, but thinking about what I would like to see in the 10 years, I think if we can look at having a more shared understanding across the different programs of care that we're actually currently working in. Even now within my adult brain injury work, I'm very much focused on physical health and disability. That's where my service sits. I think there is mental health issues. There are medical needs that need to be there. But, I think rehabilitation following on from all kinds of injuries, spinal injuries, orthopedic injuries, and so on, I think there is a learning that can come, and there's probably some merit in giving some consideration to how we take the learnings of how people adjust to conditions, how people reorder their lives, how do they readjust to the changes that happen as a result of significant illnesses and injuries. We've mentioned cancer already. We have people coming through our service who have had brain tumors, which is a type of cancer, so there's something about maybe not being overly focused on the cause of the clients or the service users' need, and being more focused on the need. So whether that's a need in terms of support for them to continue being a parent, or to return to work, or to actually be maintained and managed, given the fact that they have actually got very significant needs that actually only can be provided for in a very supportive residential setting potentially. I think having that kind of breaking down and moving towards that idea of no more silos and seeing people's needs more holistically would be something that would make me proud, and I would be open to doing that, because I think we can actually learn from the other services as well. I'm very heavily involved with mental health right now in terms of the number of our service users. There's huge insights that those mental health practitioners can provide, but equally I'm hopeful that we're able to provide insight into the behavior management and the issues that they're trying to deal with on a day-to-day basis. We get more from working together with this. So if we could move to a less siloed system of arranging services, I would be very, very happy with that.
Yeah, thanks very much. And then Bridget, over to you for almost the final word.
No, agree. I think services need to be collaborative. They need to be coordinated. They need to be person-centered. They need to include the family and all aspects of the person's life. And they need to be, certainly in terms of acquired brain injury, it needs to be long-term and as and when required. And it needs to be multi-agency. It needs to be health, education, social services, voluntary, and it needs to include all and be a holistic model of care.
Thank you. It would be remiss of me, and I'm very mindful of the time, because I wanted just to reflect on, we have some really interesting questions and some really interesting comments as well. So they won't be lost, because when we write this up, I'll make sure those comments are picked up and circulated to members here, because really some fantastic insights from the members of the audience. And I also wanted to highlight, which the Minister did, the role of the sectors working together, whether the statutory, political, as it were, through Colm, and also through the voluntary sector members, many of whom are represented in the audience today, who obviously I would say are underfunded and under-resourced, but they're a fantastic resource for us all. I want also to thank the Minister for coming along this afternoon for Gordon Gough, our chairman, for opening this, and particularly to thank the panel members. I mean, it was a difficult brief in such a short time to be asked both very broad and very specific questions around services. But I want to say a genuine thank you to all the panelists and for everyone who stuck with us this afternoon. And we will be writing up this panel discussion and circulating the comments. And also just to thank the team behind this. So you appreciate putting together a discussion, large or small, does take a lot of work. And I wanted to thank the team from Brain Injury Matters, Trassa Rice, Francis McConville, and also Catherine Tweedy and Podrick from Planned Events, who keep us on track and make sure the thing's done properly. So thanks again to everybody, and thank you for your time, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the evening. And also, I should be remiss of me to say, please fill out the evaluation and we'll come back to you with the write-up of this evening's session. And thanks again to Colm and the team. Thank you, Bridget. Thank you, Eunan. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you now.
Good night. Bye-bye.